There are two stories sitting on the table right now that demand serious, undivided attention. And while they may appear to occupy different corners of the sports landscape, they are connected by a thread that runs directly through the center of everything the WNBA is trying to build. One story is about roster decisions being made by the Indiana Fever. The other is about the most significant media rights expansion in the history of women's professional basketball. And the reason both stories matter, the reason they need to be examined together rather than separately, is because both of them ultimately lead back to the same person. The same commercial engine, the same foundational reality that the league either fully embraces or quietly works against at its own peril. Let us begin with the Indiana Fever and what is happening with their roster construction, because it is generating legitimate questions that deserve honest examination rather than dismissal.
The Indiana Fever have established a visible and consistent pattern of signing players from the South Carolina Gamecocks program. This is not a new observation. It has been building over time, and with each addition, it becomes harder to characterize as coincidence and easier to identify as deliberate organizational philosophy. The most recent development in this pattern is the signing of Brie Jones, a South Carolina product whose arrival was met with immediate and enthusiastic public celebration from none other than Gamecocks head coach Dawn Staley herself. Let that detail sit for a moment because it is worth examining carefully. Dawn Staley, the head coach of a college basketball program, took to social media with visible excitement to celebrate a professional franchise's roster move involving her former player. The energy of that response, the speed of it, and the public platform it occupied suggests something more than a coach being generically proud of a former player's professional opportunity. Coaches celebrate their players constantly, but the specific enthusiasm directed at the Indiana Fever as an organization and the degree of alignment it suggests between Staley and the Fever's front office raises a legitimate question. How deep does the relationship between this franchise and the South Carolina program actually run, and who is it primarily serving? Because here is the context that cannot be separated from this conversation. Caitlin Clark, the player around whom the entire Indiana Fever franchise is commercially and competitively constructed, has a history with the South Carolina Gamecocks that is anything but warm. The rivalry between Clark's Iowa Hawkeyes and Staley's Gamecocks was one of the most emotionally charged narratives in recent women's college basketball history. That history did not dissolve when Clark signed her professional contract. It exists, it is documented, and it is part of the background against which the Indiana Fever's apparent organizational affinity for South Carolina alumni must be evaluated. Nobody is arguing that South Carolina does not produce talented players. The program's track record speaks clearly. Aja Wilson and Aaliyah Boston, two of the highest compensated players in the entire WNBA, both developed within that system. The Gamecocks are a legitimate pipeline, and acknowledging that is simply being accurate. But the quality of a pipeline does not fully explain the frequency and consistency with which one specific professional organization returns to it, particularly when that organization's central competitive identity is built around a player with complicated history connected to that same program. The Brie Jones signing has sharpened this question considerably. At the same time Jones was being brought in, the fan community was actively and vocally advocating for an alternative. Kate Martin. The argument for Martin was grounded in observable reality. She is a player with a demonstrated on-court connection to Caitlin Clark, a complementary skill set that serves Clark's style of play and an established comfort level within the offensive environment Clark generates. The case against Martin, the counter-argument offered in various spaces, was that the Fever needed defensive reinforcement and that Jones addresses that need more directly. That is a basketball argument. It deserves to be treated as one. But basketball arguments have to be evaluated against basketball outcomes. And the question being raised is whether Brie Jones meaningfully and demonstrably elevates Indiana's defensive performance in a way that justifies passing on a player who would have made the most important person on the roster more effective and more comfortable. When you hold that question up against the evidence of what this team's defensive unit has looked like through the early portion of this season, the answer is not obvious, and the optics of repeatedly choosing South Carolina alumni over players who might optimize Caitlin Clark's experience within her own franchise are not something the organization can indefinitely ignore. There is also the front court dimension of the roster situation that has been largely overlooked in the Jones conversation. Monique Billings is dealing with an injury. Aaliyah Boston is returning from injury. The interior of this roster is exposed right now in a way that became painfully visible in the opening game loss to Dallas, where rebounding and size were factors in the final outcome. An argument can be made, and has been made, that prioritizing another big, addressing the front court vulnerability with targeted personnel, would have been a more pressing basketball need than adding another guard. Whether a suitable front court option was available or financially feasible is a separate question. But the decision to address the guard rotation with a South Carolina product at a moment when the interior was clearly the more urgent need does raise questions about whether basketball logic or relational loyalty is driving these choices. And Dawn Staley jumping onto social media the moment the signing was announced, celebrating the move with language directed specifically at the Indiana Fever as an organization, does nothing to quiet those questions. It amplifies them. Now let us turn to the media rights story, because this is where the commercial stakes of everything being discussed become impossible to minimize. What was already understood to be a landmark media rights agreement for the WNBA has expanded into something even larger. The league had previously announced a deal valued at approximately $2.2 billion, with Walt Disney, NBC, and Amazon as the primary broadcast partners. That deal alone represented a transformational moment for women's professional basketball, a commercial validation of scale that reflected genuine growth in viewership, fan engagement, and market relevance. But the league went back, and they came back with more. According to reporting from Front Office Sports, the WNBA has added USA Network as a broadcast partner while also renewing agreements with Paramount and Scripps, the company operating the ION network. The result of those additions and renewals is an 11-year media rights portfolio, now valued at approximately $3.1 billion in total. The annual value of this expanded arrangement works out to roughly $281 million per year. Now compare that number to where this league was before its commercial trajectory changed. The previous media rights deal was valued at approximately $43 million annually, from $43 million per year to $281 million per year. That is not growth. That is not an upward trend on a chart. That is a complete categorical transformation of what this league represents as a commercial property in the eyes of the most sophisticated media companies on the planet. Disney, NBC, Amazon, USA Network, Paramount, Scripps. These are not organizations that make 11-year, multi-billion-dollar commitments based on optimism or goodwill. They make those commitments based on projected audience size, advertising revenue calculations, and a genuine belief that the viewership will be there consistently across the duration of the agreement. When companies of that stature collectively decide that the WNBA is worth $3.1 billion over 11 years, they are making a statement about what they believe this league can deliver in terms of sustained audience engagement. And WNBA Commissioner Cathy Engelbert has stepped forward to contextualize this growth as a product of organizational vision and strategic leadership. She has pointed to the expansion of nationally televised games as evidence of the league's development trajectory under her stewardship, noting that the league went from 15 nationally televised games per season when she took over to more than 216 games on national platforms this season, representing over 65% of the regular season schedule being broadcast nationally. She has framed this as the result of deliberate, sustained organizational effort. This is where the conversation requires some directness, because Engelbert's framing, while not entirely without merit, omits the central fact that explains why media companies suddenly found the WNBA worth a $3.1 billion investment. The question is simple: what changed? What specifically caused Disney, NBC, Amazon, and the additional partners to collectively recalibrate their valuation of the WNBA upward to this degree? Was it a new marketing strategy? Was it a revised organizational structure? Was it improved officiating or expanded community outreach? No. What changed is that Caitlin Clark entered the league and immediately produced the most dramatic single-season commercial impact any player in women's professional basketball history has generated. She sold out arenas in cities that had never sold out for WNBA games before. She drove merchandise sales to levels the league had never seen. She generated broadcast ratings that networks had not associated with women's basketball in years and in some cases ever. She brought an entirely new category of casual sports fan into contact with this league and gave them a reason to keep watching. Media companies are not sentimental, they are analytical. When they looked at the WNBA after Caitlin Clark's arrival and saw the viewership numbers, the ticket demand, the merchandise velocity, and the social media engagement she generated, they updated their models, they revised their projections, and they committed billions of dollars because their data told them the audience was real, the growth was real, and the commercial opportunity was real. That is not organizational strategy. That is the Caitlin Clark effect, manifested in the financial commitments of the world's largest media companies. For Engelbert to step to the microphone and describe this commercial transformation through the lens of league leadership without explicitly and prominently crediting the player who drove the audience growth that made those media deals possible is a framing decision that matters. It matters not because of credit allocation as a symbolic exercise, but because how leadership understands the source of its own success shapes how it makes decisions going forward. If the league's commissioner genuinely believes this commercial explosion was produced by organizational vision rather than by one player's generational impact, then the decisions flowing from that belief about how that player is protected, deployed, surrounded, and supported may not reflect the actual value and vulnerability of the foundation being built upon. And that is where the South Carolina roster construction conversation and the media rights expansion story merge into a single, urgent concern. The $3.1 billion media rights deal is, when examined honestly, a financial instrument built on the assumption that Caitlin Clark will continue to be healthy, performing at an elite level, and generating the audience engagement that media partners paid for. Every dollar of that $281 million annual valuation exists because of the expectation that the Clark audience is real and durable. Networks do not pay for infrastructure, they pay for eyeballs. And the eyeballs they are paying for are, in overwhelming proportion, there because of one person. Which means every organizational decision that affects Clark's performance environment, her happiness within the franchise, her comfort with her teammates, and her ability to operate within a system that maximizes her strengths is not just a basketball decision with basketball consequences. It is a financial decision with implications attached to a multi-billion-dollar commercial agreement spanning 11 years. When you understand the stakes at that level, the question of whether the Fever should have signed Brie Jones or Kate Martin stops being a fan preference debate. It becomes a question about whether organizational decision-making is aligned with the commercial reality the organization depends on for its survival and growth. When you understand the stakes at that level, Dawn Staley's enthusiastic social media celebration of yet another South Carolina signing to the Indiana Fever roster stops being a heartwarming moment of coach-player connection and starts being a data point in a pattern that deserves serious scrutiny. There is also the viewership dimension that adds immediate urgency to all of this. Reports circulating around the early portion of this season have noted a noticeable dip in ratings, not catastrophic, not the kind of collapse that triggers emergency meetings and dramatic restructuring, but visible, measurable, a dip that observers who watch these numbers closely are already identifying and discussing. Season ticket availability for the Fever has shown some softening relative to the unprecedented demand that characterized last season. The opening home game drew solid attendance, but whether that level sustains across 80-plus games is a genuine and open question. The viewership numbers from the first game of the season against the Dallas Wings had not been released publicly at the time of this reporting. Those numbers, when they emerge, will function as an early and important signal about the health of the audience the $3.1 billion media rights deal was built around. If those numbers disappoint, if they come in meaningfully below comparable games from last season, it will not be a